Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
Thanks for checking into the best Houston sports podcast. Robert with my co-host, Sports Radio 610, Shaun Bijani. Later in the show, we discuss Dusty Baker's sudden retirement just in as we started recording. Tomorrow, I've got a Carolina Panthers insider to preview the Texans game, and we're about to preview the CJ Stroud, Bryce Young matchup in seconds. But Shaun, let's start with some good news. The Texans getting back a few guys from injury. Tank Dell, maybe Hassan Ridgeway, Tavierre Thomas, Denzel Perryman. Am I missing anybody?
Well, Josh Jones, too. He's a guy that's been out for a little bit. There was a trio of players out with hand injuries, and they were all wearing clubs. You talked about Perryman, you talked about Thomas. Josh Jones was one of those. Didn't see any clubs, but there's still some heavy wraps on guys' hands in practice. I saw Denzel Perryman still sporting one today. Josh Jones, a little heavy tape job, along with Tavierre Thomas. He didn't mention Juice Scruggs, and rightfully so. He's not yet back. Still has not been seen on a practice field. And to be honest with you, I haven't seen him in the locker room probably in about 3-4 weeks either. Now, as far as Hassan Ridgeway goes, this is a big one. In my opinion, look, he's just that added depth. He's played in one game. Who knows how good this guy could be this season for the Texans that really need to continue to get production out of that defensive line. We know how good Sheldon Rankins has been, but they could certainly use depth. Hassan Ridgeway did practice Wednesday, and from what I saw in individual drills, looked pretty good. Looked like he was moving around okay. His 21-day window started today. So that means the Texans can practice him every day for 21 days. He doesn't count on the 53-man roster. And if at some point in time they feel like he can contribute, they can put him back on the 53, and then they have to make adjustments otherwise, which, roster gymnastics, they've seemingly had no problem doing that. So that's what keeps my email popping during the week is all the Derek Rivers up and down cut sign, all that mess and Nick Caserio likes to do. But Hassan Ridgeway, hey, step one, it was a good sign. At the end of the day, he didn't show up on the injury report outside of a limited participant. He's still dealing with the calf injury. But, there was a number of Texan players on the limited participant front today. And, man, we've talked about hands. And we know early in training camp and early in the season, we saw a whole bunch of guys dealing with hamstring injuries. Well, today you've got Xavier Hutchinson and Brevin Jordan, along with Robert Woods, all dealing with foot injuries. So what that's all about, who knows? Is it a little turf toe? Is it a little plantar fasciitis? Is it a blister? Who knows? But you just kind of keep your fingers crossed that, those little kind of nagging injuries don't rear their head for the Texans, and they can continue to get as close to full strength as they've been in a long time.
This week's all about Stroud versus Young, CJ Stroud, Bryce Young. If you weren't sure how close these two guys were, CJ talked about how tight they were in Wednesday's presser, and Shaun, Stroud might have surprised everybody when he said he didn't think Bryce is playing bad. CJ said Bryce is playing really well, and, quote, I don't think people are watching in depth.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a couple of things going on here. I'll give you three things. And one, Stroud mentioned himself. But we do this all the time as fans and media, is you see a team performing poorly, like the Carolina Panthers. They're 0-6. They haven't played good football as a team yet. And so I think you automatically think, man, their quarterback stinks, right? And so, look, we know Bryce Young has made some mistakes. There's been some turnovers. There's been some frustration, some disappointment that has been very visible, and his body language is on his face. But I think what CJ Stroud was talking about today as he was going through it is that, hey, I watched this film, and he's making some good reads. He's making some good throws. He looks very similar to the way that he did in college, the baller that I know he can be. And so I think CJ's looking at it a little bit from, hey, I've known this guy, competed with and against this guy since middle school. Literally middle school is how far back the relationship goes. I think he's probably looking at it through a little rose-colored glasses, so to speak. But I also think, too, that, yes, it is the case that Bryce Young probably is doing some really good things that only another football player, so to speak, could maybe easily distinguish. And that's Yeah. As a rookie, as a veteran, just, from the layman, they know what they should be looking for, and they can tell by the timing or by the body language or by a player's eyes what they're seeing when they're looking at film. So ultimately, what all that matters is Sunday, and Bryce Young going up against this Texans secondary, much better pass rush here in recent weeks, I think is going to be a big time challenge for the Panthers and Bryce Young.
Hey, CJ Stroud, he's got a thrown football now in the NFL Hall of Fame. If you missed it, the football he set the record with for most pass attempts to start a rookie season without an interception is now on display in Canton. So that's kind of cool, Shaun.
I guess, but you know where that last pass wound up? It was on the sideline somewhere because he threw it away. So, Stroud, I think, knew exactly that. And that was kind of the response that was elicited today. As somebody brought that up to him. He was like, yeah, I guess that's kind of cool. Hall of Fame. Yeah, why not? But I think in his mind, he's like, I know how I got there. And then a week later, he throws his first interception, which is literally the best interception anybody could ever throw because 2 milliseconds later, you get the ball back after a Nico Collins forced fumble. So, hey, that's cool. CJ Stroud, my guess is going to have a lot more cooler things memorabilia-wise to display in Canton, Ohio throughout the course of his maybe rookie season, but certainly his career, because I think the dude's destined to do some pretty unique and special things. Not saying he's going to be a Hall of Famer, but, maybe accomplishing some cool things that makes its way up there to Canton. That'd be cool.
If CJ is bad this week and Bryce is good this week, everybody's going to go, oh, maybe, it's one of those things, Shaun. What have you done for me lately? And it just seems like if something goes wrong in this game for CJ for whatever reason, people are going to notice because this is the game where everybody's spotlighting the Texans and the two quarterbacks.
100%. And maybe that's right. Maybe that's wrong. Who knows? You're still going to be, for both of these teams, keep in mind the Panthers are coming off of a bye week themselves. You'd be 7 games into a season. But yeah, this is the first time. And it's not to say that people haven't been paying attention to the Texans all along and that people haven't been paying attention on Bryce Young. Look, he was the number 1 overall pick, and the Texans are surprising a lot of people. And they've beaten 2 pretty damn good teams already in the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Jacksonville Jaguars. Look, they took care of a New Orleans Saints team that at the end of the day might be a team that's in the mix towards the end of the season themselves. Who knows? But this is the head-to-head, and you're going to see and hear and read all kinds of different stories throughout the course of a week, how they've been playing basketball together for, the last decade when it's not football season, that they played in middle school, that, they used to compete in 7-on-7s, that they trained together in the off seasons during college, and they haven't experienced one obviously yet together in the NFL regular season or in NFL as an NFL player. But you're going to hear all of those stories. At the end of the day, it's magnified as it should be. And whoever comes out on top, I think, their personal story is going to be exacerbated, exaggerated, more talked about, more spotlight put on them. And you know what? Good for them. Rightfully so. This is your 1 and 2 picks. But I think at the end of the day, regardless of win or loss, I fully expect both of these guys to actually play pretty good, sound football. Certainly, we've seen a lot more of Stroud than we have of Bryce Young. At least I have. I mean, that's the only team I'm watching these days is the Texans, with 2 eyes. But you certainly expect to see the same similar Stroud, if not a more improved one, because that's exactly who you've gotten each and every week. CJ's taking the field. For Bryce, look, think about the way we talk this guy up in the pre-draft process and watching him, his final year at Alabama. Dude is a competitor. Dude is a baller. Dude plays with a chip on his shoulder. I mean, what guy that hadn't been successful doesn't? I fully expect Bryce to kind of take his game to the next level, at least as much as the Texans defense will allow him to. And quite honestly, maybe his own offense outside of Adam Thielen, he really hadn't very many guys to throw the ball to.
Will Anderson picked 2 after Bryce Young. This might be his chance to get to the quarterback too, with that Carolina, sort of sifty with a bunch of, water coming through the dike offensive line.
Yeah, the Panthers offensive line, I don't know if you had a chance to see this today, but I saw somebody had released like a composite grade of every NFL team's offensive line, and it was the PFF grade. It was the SIS, which is like sports information, something or other, and then the ESPN grade. And cumulatively, the Texans grade out as 13th in the NFL. But conversely, the Carolina Panthers are in the bottom half of the league. I can't remember their exact ranking, but I think they're in the bottom 10, 11 teams in terms of offensive line. And look, it's kind of been the case, right? When you talked about Bryce Young, and we saw it a little bit, as I mentioned, his final year at Alabama, the way that he was able to maneuver the pocket, it was intriguing. It was kind of exciting. And it was because at times he made it look so damn effortless with his footwork in the pocket. It might just be a little shimmy or a little duck or step up to evade pressure in the pocket. Well, he hadn't been able to do that yet, with any regularity in the NFL, because he's getting it from the left, from the right, up the middle, all points in between. And that's really thrown him off his game. And so hopefully the Texans can continue to do that. And Will Anderson maybe starts to see some results in terms of not just the pressures, but in the form of maybe sacks, more strip sacks, and quarterback hits.
If anybody should know what Bryce Young does in the pocket, it should be Will Anderson.
Yeah.
He spent a lot of practices going up against Bryce Young. So that's going to be sort of a fun underlying story while everybody's caught up in the Bryce versus CJ. There's a real mano on the field thing. And, we got to talk, Shaun, about the dumpster fire part of the Texans team right now. And the dumpster fire part of the Texans team has been their running game. Any chance their running game improves this week?
Yeah, I think the Texans probably have their best rushing performance all season long, and it might be by a lot, to be honest with you. And it's based off of two things. And one, something a little bit more tangible that you can maybe hang your hat on, and that's the way that they ran the football in the first half against the New Orleans Saints. They ran for nearly 100 yards in the first half. Now, look, their run game was, pretty much stifled in the second half, along with their offense. That was a grit out type of victory that their defense had to rise to the occasion and kind of save their butts in that game. But the way that Bobby Slowick utilized Dameon Pierce and Devin Singletary, kind of switching it up a little bit. Singletary was more the feature back in that game and certainly saw, a lot more success. There wasn't explosive runs per se. I think Singletary rattled one off for maybe about 17, 18 yards at one point in time. But I think just the encouraging signs that you saw from them in that Saints game, coupled with the fact that the Carolina Panthers suck as a run defense. There's not been one time this season through the first 6 games of the year in which they've allowed less than 130 yards on the ground. And that came week 1. Every week, pretty much, with the exception of one, their run game has yielded more and more yardage, yards per attempt, yards per carry. Total yards. The worst they've given up is, I believe, 162. And that was this past week or 2 weeks ago, because they had this last week as a bye. 162 yards on the ground. And I don't think the Texans have done very much better than 130 yards, maybe 120 yards themselves on the ground. So I fully expect Bobby Slowick and this offense to continue to figure out how best to utilize Pierce and Singletary, more so what we saw against the Saints, and the fact that the Panthers have shown vulnerabilities, some poor tackling as well. I feel like it should be a very plus day for the Texans run game wise.
Yeah, the number that I heard was the Panthers are 31st out of 32 NFL teams against the run. So that pretty much underlines it. And then you have another part that the Texans have got to deal with in this game, and that's Panthers wide receiver Adam Thielen, who is 7th in the NFL in receptions. How important is it to slow him down, and how do you do it?
Well, Jimmy Ward, that's going to be a really good guy to talk to, because he's typically a guy that'll cover, a slot receiver like that. He'll probably see some good time on Thielen this week, I would presume. Look, Thielen's been really, really good. He's got 3 games of 11 catches already this season. His worst game was coming off ahead of the bye. He only caught 2 balls for 12 yards. I'm not really sure what was going on there, especially, since I think he'd played pretty much the entire game. That was a game they'd lost 24-10 to the Atlanta Falcons, a team that the Texans, obviously a few weeks ago should have ended up beating. But how you slow him down, you got to be able to, I think press him, maybe make him work into his route a little bit more. But if you do that, then you better make darn sure you're in the neighborhood of coverage. And I don't know if the Texans are really set with the personnel to get away with that. We haven't seen it. So there's no reason to think they would do it, but I think that's how you've got to be able to slow a guy like that down. Maybe they can get creative. Ultimately, I'd like to see them continue to do what they've been doing. And if you're going to go pretty much heavy zone, then just be in better position to contest balls coming your player's way, right? Because I think they'd like to play a little bit more man, but you don't have the personnel to do that. Maybe one guy that would help you, at least on the edges, do that isn't going to be available, presumably, for another 2, 3, 4 weeks. Who knows with Derek Stingley? Shaquille Griffin against the Saints, we saw a couple of PIs. I think we saw one his first game in for Stingley about 4 weeks ago. He's a good coverage guy, but he's very handsy. He's very physical, and sometimes he's just going to burn you because he gets a little too handsy. So I think the best way to approach this thing, especially in the slot with Thielen, where you're going to be asking a safety to come down and cover him, maybe even a bump out backer, in the flat to intermediate areas, just continue to play your zone, do your job, and execute when they do come in.
Last thoughts about the Texans. Anything interesting from the locker room? I know they had the big locker room session on Wednesday. You just got back from that a few hours ago. Any final things that are on your mind with them?
Not really. I wish I could have told you about a conversation that I had with Will Anderson, but he was kind of in and out in the shower and off to meetings today. I would love to have talked to Will Anderson about going up against Bryce Young for the first time in the NFL. Hopefully, I'll have an opportunity to do that on Thursday. Didn't get a chance to talk to Dameon Pierce either. He hadn't spoken to the media, maybe even before the week of the Saints game. I don't think he addressed the media the week of the Saints game. Maybe he came to the podium for a few moments, but I really can't remember. I'd love to talk to him and just see how he evaluated himself in this run game within this offense and what he's been able to identify, if anything, that he feels, I could take a little chunk from what success we had in the Saints game and apply it, going forward to the next 11 weeks. Or, I found something else. It's a timing issue. It's another half step back, or, whatever the case is. Anxious to talk to Singletary and Pierce about the run game. But aside from that, the most encouraging thing for the Texans, you mentioned it to start the show, it's just health. And knock on wood, they appear to be slowly but surely getting a little bit healthier.
Let's move to the news that just broke before we started. Dusty Baker announces his retirement. 26 years as a major league manager. He leaves with the 7th most wins of any manager in baseball history, the fourth most playoff wins, and the 4th most playoff appearances. Shaun, besides Chaz, who's popping champagne bottles right now, Chaz McCormick somewhere, he's going to be in the club tonight, yucking it up, loving everything. No, I'm just kidding. Chaz loves Dusty, I know. Besides Chaz, what's your reaction to Dusty coming back or not coming back?
I mean, I was a Dusty Baker guy. I thought, he was the perfect guy to come in when he did, and be a face and a calming influence for this team. I mean, we all know that, and I think we would all agree with that same sentiment. But it's tough because, as quick as he says, "Hey, I'm gone," he says, "I'll be back." In some capacity, probably not to manage a ball club, but maybe in an advisory role or something like that, presumably somewhere in California, maybe with the Giants under Bob Melvin, their new manager over there. But it's because he can contribute to this game still. I mean, you watched it. We were blessed with, that that library of baseball knowledge for 4 years in the city of Houston, man. And I think that's something that we absolutely innately take for granted. And it's because, well, he had already started a pretty damn good 3-year run prior to Dusty coming along, but he maintained it. And in many respects, I feel like maybe made things even better, maybe made them even stronger, maybe galvanized players on this team that another manager or managers felt like maybe they just couldn't do it the same way. And you know what? Chances are you probably wouldn't have been able to do it the same way because not everybody's Dusty Baker. He's a unique individual, and I think that's what I'm going to miss the most. I didn't have one single solitary interaction with him throughout the course of these 4 years, but once upon a time ago when he coached and managed the Cincinnati Reds and I covered the Astros on a daily basis, I had an opportunity to sit in his office for about 45 minutes before the ball game, and I can not tell you how amazed and thrilled and lucky I was, because it was shortly after my grandfather had passed away, where I hadn't heard as many cool stories from one man with so much knowledge and experience, and having met so many great ball players, coached them, played with and against them, than I did from Dusty Baker, just aside from my grandfather, who could share those stories with me. And so from Hank Aaron stories to, just dealing with guys like Barry Bonds over the years, and what he thought of the current Astros roster back then that was comprised of Michael Bourne and Hunter Pence and still a Biggio playing, is just pretty cool. And so I'm just going to miss the wisdom, the knowledge, the one-liners that he'd give you, the grizzly, growling, Dusty, dealing with reporters that he didn't like or right after losses. That's what I'm going to miss. But it's going to be a pivotal moment for the Astros to pick the next guy. It has to be the right guy because the window is still very much open.
Yeah, the cool thing about having Dusty around is, how many more guys do we have in sports that have this connection to the golden era, connection to Hank Aaron? I mean, he was on we've talked about it. He was on the on-deck circle when Hank Aaron hit the home run that passes Babe Ruth. He was on the field when Nolan Ryan threw his 5th no-hitter in the Astrodome way back in 1981, I think it was, 1980, 81. I'm blanking on which year, but he was right there. And then, all the connections to all the guys that he has around the game. I'm not going to miss the grumpy Dusty after the game stuff, just like I didn't and don't miss the Bill O'Brien grumpy stuff. And I'm not big into grumpy coaches after game stuff, but, I want to rewind and play something for you guys from our Game 7 post game, and just address again with this clip from our post-game show in case you missed it. Some of you probably wanted to go to sleep, didn't want to watch our live post-game, which I totally understand after that game. But this is what Steven and I said about what Dusty accomplished with this year's team and over his time here in Houston. Here's just a little bit of that.
It is easy to be a little heartbroken after this, but what if I told you before the season started that you wouldn't have Lance McCullers or Luis Garcia all year long? You wouldn't have Jose Urquidy most of the year. Christian Javier would lose his fastball and look like a washed-up Dallas Keuchel with a 4+ ERA this year. Altuve would miss 72 games. Jordan would miss nearly 50. Hunter Brown would be awful for half the season. Ryan Stanek had a 9 ERA. The Astros would have spent most of the year behind the Texas Rangers, but in the end, they still beat the Rangers in the division. They still get to their 7th straight ALCS. Ladies and gentlemen, how would you feel if that's what happened after all of this?
Robert, you and I both know, and I think most fans know, it is awfully, awfully difficult to get to the World Series 3 straight years, sometimes even 2 straight years. The Astros did that in 21 and 22. They were on the cusp of doing it again this year, but it's awfully hard to do that. But they almost did it.
What I will point out to people that just jump on Dusty, Steven, you just said it. The Astros went under Dusty to the 7th game of the ALCS, the World Series. They won a championship, winning in that season 11-2 in the postseason, 11-2. And then we just went over all the stuff that the Astros went through here this year, still getting to the 7th game of the ALCS. You can go, I hate this Dusty decision, I hate that Dusty decision. But bottom line is, you can't hate the results. You're not going to win the World Series every year, especially when you're beset by injury after injury after injury. And what he did during the pandemic was ridiculous. I mean, they were terrible that year, and they still almost got to the World Series.
John, that was just a little bit, and I didn't even get into the fact that Dusty went during the pandemic season when the Astros couldn't do anything and still got to the 7th game of the ALCS. He did it without Justin Verlander. He did it without Yordan Alvarez. I didn't talk about the next year when they went to the World Series. He did it without Justin Verlander again. By the time they got to the World Series, they had no Lance McCullers. I mean, they were losing people left and right throughout his tenure, and he still got it done. And everybody on your favorite, on your favorite sports app, on your favorite social media sports app, it's just nonstop. Dusty is doing this wrong, and Dusty is doing that wrong. Look at what he's done right. Look at what he's done right. Look how good the Astros are. And there has never been a player that has come out and said, I hate this Dusty decision, even behind his back. Chandler said there was stuff about Chaz or whatever that maybe he wasn't super happy with, stuff like that. But Chaz immediately comes out and says that's not the case. Dusty comes out and says we don't have an issue with each other. These guys loved him 1 through 26 every single year he was there. And all they wanted to talk about after they won the World Series last year was Dusty Baker. He deserved it. This is his. He's the leader, all of that sort of stuff. And it's the old thing. It's the old adage is be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for. Because now all those Astros fans that did like what Dusty did and hated Dusty and wanted him gone. And let me just say, Sean, I don't think playing Yainer Diaz over Martin Maldonado against the Rangers was the difference in the Astros winning or losing that series. Yainer Diaz wasn't going to knock in 9 runs or 8 runs or whatever you needed, to beat the Rangers in Game 7. He wasn't going to do it. It wasn't going to happen. So, enough with that.
Yeah, well, maybe the one guy that could have led the American League in RBIs this year, in Kyle Tucker, and he didn't show up at all during the entire postseason. So you don't fault Dusty Baker for perennial all-star type players that don't show up. The one thing that just echoes the point that I made earlier, in that it's almost commonplace and obvious now that the guy's gone, because we always look back and talk about the good things and how the bad times really weren't so bad, and you'd take them twice on Sunday now because you don't have them anymore. But it's that look, we took them for granted. We took the Astros for granted. It was innate. It was inevitable. It happened. We lived through it. We enjoyed it, but did we enjoy it as much as we possibly could have? Do we ever in anything? The one thing that Dusty Baker, brought to the clubhouse and to each and every one of the players, I think, was not taken for granted by them. And that's the way that he just knew how to be with people. It was nothing that, man, I've got to do it this way. I've got to say this. It's just Dusty and 6 decades of baseball in his blood that has made him who he is. And it's corny as hell, but because he's in the wine business, I'd say it this way. When you know how to deal with the ball player, when you know how to deal with a room full of ball players that, bring all of their daily struggles and even struggles at work to work, and that are working so tirelessly to just get over this, that, and the other thing in their lives. Sometimes when you've done that for, your entire life, pretty much as Dusty Baker has since he was the age of 18 in professional baseball, it does become one of those things that ages like a fine wine. You just know how to press everybody's buttons, and you know how to listen, and you know how to react. And I'll guarantee you this, Chaz and Dusty probably disagreed 10 times a week on something. But at the end of the day, because both had mutual respect for one another, and maybe more so coming from Chaz to Dusty than vice versa, who knows? But that's why you keep it professional. And Dusty did that better than anybody, maybe during the course of his career in baseball. But more importantly, for Astro fans, he did it better than anybody and represented the Astros better than anybody ever has. during a really tough stretch, during the greatest time, in Astros history, getting a second World Series in 2022. It was just classy. It was great. We're all going to miss him. And the best to Dusty, because whoever he ends up contributing for in some form or shape, form, or fashion, they're going to be lucky for it.
Last thing I'll say about Dusty's retirement is you have to feel a little bit as though Dusty can see the end coming with the Astros. And I think this is part of the equation. And, if Dusty thought, hey, next year they're going to win the championship, he would have thought, I think, much longer and much harder about this decision. I think there still would have been a chance that he would have come back. But when he looks at what's going on right now, and I know Astros fans just want to say, well, most of the key guys are coming back. You're a little worried about Hector Neris, whatever about Phil Maton. I don't know if that's a big loss. If he ends up going, Michael Brantley, we know, is probably gone. So, there's some guys here and there. But we talk about, Bregman still got a year left. Altuve still got a year left, and so on and so forth. But look, Dusty, what he did with the pitching staff this year was a minor miracle. It was devastating. And the problem with the pitching staff this year is none of this stuff is guaranteed to come back next year. Is Christian Javier going to return to the Christian Javier we saw 2 years ago? Who knows? I thought it looked like a dead arm. I said after the Game 7 postgame, whenever he had longer rest this year, he looked like a much better pitcher, and he was back to regular rest for this Game 7. So that was my point. So maybe with the rest in the offseason, Christian Javier comes back. But I don't know. He doesn't have a long, long history. Framber Valdez, I don't know what's going on with him. And you don't know with Framber. It's all, between the ears with that guy. So, you just don't know, has he lost it again? When we saw he didn't have it really when he was brought up originally with the Astros. Lance McCullers, wouldn't count on him. Luis Garcia, wouldn't count on him. Jose Urquidy, constantly injured. I don't know. Is he going to come back? Justin Verlander is going to be 41 here, whatever. He's old. And, at some point, Father Time wins every time. Father Time's going to get you. So the starting pitching staff has got some real question marks. And Hunter Brown and JP France, we'll see. Those guys pitch for about, half a year good, but we have no idea what those guys are going to do. And this starting pitching staff is in big time flux, and they need some luck next year for some of these guys to get back. Because you're not going to minor league yourself back to this from a starting pitching perspective. No way.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of question marks, and you just hit on most of them, I think. And the encouraging thing is that you mentioned two guys, JP France and Hunter Brown. Hey, what better situation could those guys have come into where, you get seemingly thrown into the fire early on in the season in some major roles on a team that has had a bullseye on its back for the better part of a decade, and you pitch the way that those two guys did to start the year. They went through their trials and tribulations as professionals, but that's the one reason why I'm encouraged by it, in that, too, you do have a guy like Justin Verlander that's still on the staff that's going to be here presumably for the next couple of years to help with that. And a lot of other guys, too. Look, the Astros pitching coach is headed by Josh Miller. That's a big one too. Do I think the Astros could do better in that regard? I don't know. If the Astros decided, you know what, we like these two guys, instead of doing what we can to convince Brent Strom to stick around a couple of years ago when they had the opportunity, but decided to let him walk and drift into retirement before he changed his mind to go to the World Series with the Diamondbacks this year. Hey, so be it. They have some personnel decisions to make. They have some player decisions to make. They don't have a ton of money to spend this offseason in free agency, and the decisions that they do have to make in terms of retaining their 5 free agents aren't exactly make or break for any of them. So it's going to be interesting. Like, in large part, for the second straight year, you're going to be able to bring back pretty much everybody you ended the season with. But there are some key figures in Martin Maldonado and in Michael Brantley and in Dusty Baker that presumably at least 2/3 of those guys aren't going to be here. If Martin Maldonado returns in a much lower role, basically if him and Yiner flip roles for next season, I don't know how that's going to break, but you could do a lot worse than keeping a guy around like Martin Maldonado with, again, the wealth of knowledge that he has in handling the pitching staff and just knowing this pitching staff. So it'll be interesting to see, but
how about this? Martin Maldonado as the next Astros manager. I haven't heard that batted around, but if
you would have said bench coach, I would have said, yeah, you know what? That is probably a real strong possibility. And I feel that way. But it also comes down to a few variables. And one that, look, Dana Brown, I don't know what that relationship, and I'm talking about professional relationship, is like with Jim Crane. I don't know if he was brought in to necessarily be your prototypical general manager or basically an advanced talent evaluator. He's a scout at heart, and he's been a damn good one throughout his career. But something tells me that with the reports that we heard per Brian McTaggart, that Jim Crane and Jeff Bagwell are going to oversee the search for their new manager, while Dana Brown just simply has a say, maybe says a lot more to the fact that we heard whispers and roars months ago in regard to David Stearns, whom now the Astros had missed out on, and he went to one of the New York teams up there, right? Was it the Mets or the Yankees? I can't remember. But if they were looking for that guy to come in and be a presumable president of baseball operations, a guy like that would be very much in charge of finding the next manager for your ball club. And if not him, then it would be Dana Brown, typically under what we think general managers do. Well, that's not the case, apparently. So it's going to be very interesting to see the road the Astros go down in terms of who they think is going to be and should be the next manager. Is it Brad Ausmus because of the relationship with Jeff Bagwell? Is it, Ron Washington because he's another older, calming influence, old baseball guy? I highly doubt it. I think any list you see him on is immediately discredited. The Astros, they said they want to get younger. Well, you know what? Joe Espada's not an old codger. In fact, he probably makes the most sense because he'd survived A.J. Hinch. He should survive Dusty Baker in terms of being able to get a manager job somewhere in Major League Baseball. I think it should be here. And my only reasoning is this, and I think it's the most logical. When you're returning most of your guys, your entire core, why do you need to change the culture? It's so hard to find that guy that immediately aligns with everything that you already had in place. And not to say that, hey, you know what, there ain't some things that are broke and that need fixing. But Joe Espada gets it. And I think you could do a hell of a lot worse than putting your faith and your trust in a guy that has done more than enough to prove that he's ready to lead a Major League ball club. Why not the one that he has the most familiarity with?
Yeah, the thing about Joe Espada is he hasn't gone anywhere, and we kept thinking that somebody was going to hire him. He was going to go somewhere, and you wonder what the conversations were like with Joe Espada the last few years and how he ended up staying with the Astros. Last thing that I want to bring up, and there's a lot more Astros questions coming up down the road as we move into the next few weeks. Last thing I'll bring up is Bruce Bochy was a guy that Dusty Baker went to and discussed this decision with. They're close friends. Two of the great managers that we just saw of all time going up against each other in this last series. One of the real reasons why the series was fun. While I hate one ex-Astro catcher that's a manager, Scott Service, Bruce Bochy, tip of the cap to that guy. Nothing but respect. One of the great managers ever. If people forget, Bruce Bochy was an original Houston Astro, was drafted by the Astros, went through the minor leagues. He was a backup catcher. An important thing to remember, Bruce Bochy in Game 4 of the Astros-Phillies series in the LCS in 1980 was at the plate when Pete Rose ran over him when he missed a short hop throw from the outfield. And that run ended up being the winning run against the Astros in Game 4. The Astros would lose in Game 5 after having a 2-0 lead against the Phillies in that series. It's interesting to me that Bruce Bochy had a chance to exact his revenge, but the Diamondbacks took it away from him. He's not going to face the Phillies now in the championship and in the World Series. So that's a little interesting side note. The other side note is, of course, everybody knows about Brent Strom. What an amazing job that guy continues to do. If there's any pitching coach that should be in the Hall of Fame, like before he retires, it's Brent Strom, because 2 years ago, the Diamondbacks stunk, and he's turned them into a World Series team 2 years later. I mean, it was just 2 years ago. I mean, we think it's a long time ago. Brent Strom was here just 2 years ago, and he's already got this Diamondback pitching staff, one of the best in baseball, and he's gotten to the World Series, doing it with some young guys too, and just amazing stuff. So, I'll definitely be rooting for some Brent Strom in that. Robbie Grossman, we didn't even mention this much in the Astros or Rangers series. Houston area kid, original Houston Astros, called up with the Astros in the rebuild. So he's now in the World Series. Kind of cool story. That's all we got for this one. I do want to remind people that me and Sean will be doing the live Texans postgame. He's got some stuff to do. We've talked about the last live postgame. He's got a little bit of stuff to do over at Sports Radio 610, which is going to run us maybe an hour or two behind normal. So it's going to be closer to 5 o'clock when our live Texans postgame. If you miss it, don't worry. It's there. It's up on YouTube. Just look in the live section. It's always there. All the live shows are there. Go check them out. If you missed our Game 7 postgame where we got into all sorts of stuff, me and Steven, go listen to that. Also, go watch the Game 5 postgame if you just want to feel good. Had a great one with RG about the Altuve walk-off, or sort of walk-off home run, game-winning home run against the Rangers, and what I still believe is one of the top, despite not winning the series, I still think it's one of the top 5 Astros playoff games I've ever seen. And so that's worth reliving too if you get into the archives. But otherwise, we'll talk to you again come Texans time, me and Sean. But don't forget, tomorrow we got Carolina Panthers Insider. We'll talk more about this Texans game. A lot to discuss. We'll go back to talking CJ Stroud and what he's seeing with Bryce Young. So that should be fun. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Hey, don't forget to support us by subscribing and commenting on YouTube. You can always listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends about us and share our show links on social media. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.